Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
The United States has crossed the Libyan's line of death. We might be moving into the Nicaraguan line of fire. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll talk about some of the tough foreign policy decisions facing the Reagan administration and the Congress, and some of the warlike actions that are going on around the world. Our guests today are Bruce Galehood from the Department of History here at Ball State University, Dwight Hoover, also from the Department of History, and John Rouse from the Department of Political Science. John, are we in a war mode, a war mindset at this point?
Yes, we are in this sense. In every society, I think you have the propensity to foster economics and also foster the defense of those economics. I think this is something that has not been short in coming. Instead, it's been something that has been coming for some time. Libya and Gaddafi have threatened not only the economic interest of this country, but also the economic interests of other nations. Since the economics in this country are pretty good at this time, I think there will be the focus upon how to protect the economics in the future, i.e. Protect the oil fields, protect the economies of Western Europe. So to answer your question, I say yes, we're moving towards a war mode.
The Libyan situation, obviously a lot of talk, a lot of press. We went into the Bay of Sidra and provoked an attack from the Libyans. Is that pretty much it, Bruce?
No, not if you believe the statements of the State Department or the Joint Chiefs of Staff or essentially the American authorities in general that the United States exercises the right to conduct naval operations anywhere in the world.
That's what they said now.
Well, but that's an age-old principle of American foreign policy too, Larry. It's, you can go back to the Revolutionary early national period. Freedom of the seas has been a time-tested American doctrine. Look at World War I, and one of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, indeed, was freedom of the seas. So certainly the Libyans, let's put it this way, would see this as provocation. However, and certainly what resulted with the clash in terms of the naval forces on each side there could be seen as provocation. It's important, I think, to look at this against a larger sequence of events here. What's going on in the Middle East is certainly a source of concern to the Reagan administration, not only what the Reagan administration calls state-sponsored terrorism on the part of the Libyans, but also challenges internally to the Mubarak regime in Egypt, the continued problems relative to Israel and Syria, which seem to be getting worse lately, the instability in Lebanon, the problem which seems to be coming with the Iran-Iraq war, where Iran now seems to be in a position to press its own position to some military advantage. All of these sorts of difficulties, let's put it that way, create problems for the Reagan administration in regard to the Middle East. And my own view, for whatever that could be worth at this time, would be that these exercises were designed to project some American power into that region. And against that backdrop, those occurred. The provocations or the lack of same on the part of the Libyans and the United States happened as a result of that. This desire on the part of the American government to make a show of force in the Middle East at this time.
Was it important, Dwight Hoover, that the United States show a little force, flex its muscle a little bit, as we do from time to time, to show that we're a superpower?
Well, I think the administration thought so. I was struck by the fact that everybody knew this was coming. Press releases said this is a show of force. Everybody was expecting that we would go across the trip line and that something would happen. I think the administration can't have it both ways. It's either a show of force, which they knew they were going to do, and they knew they were going to get some reaction, or it isn't. And I think it was a show of force. I think it was their intention. Sure, we believe in freedom of the seas, but we don't go in the Persian Gulf all the time. We don't go in other areas where there's possibility of some kind of reaction. We're usually fairly circumspect. We don't have maneuvers in politically sensitive areas unless there's a political point to be made, and I think that's pretty obvious.
And we made
I think in a way that the Libyan thing is, number one, out of the influence of both the Soviets and the United States in terms of the region or the area of the Middle East. I think a number two, in terms of a second point I could make, is that it's not an issue of ideology to a certain degree, in the sense that Gaddafi is not a communist. So it's not a thing of ideology, as is the case in Nicaragua. So it's an issue, as I think I tried to say a few minutes ago, it's an issue that, as Dwight was saying, that has been long in coming. And at some point in time, as the other areas of the Western Europe, Middle East areas are affected, people are going to have to choose sides. Or is that a possible scenario, Bruce? What do you think?
Certainly the people in Western Europe are concerned about this, because they see an increase in terrorism resulting from this, anti-Americanism throughout the Middle East, the possibility of more terrorist kinds of situations as happened last December in the bombings in the airports there. That, I think, is perhaps the fundamental question that we have to look at. What will be the result? What will come from this American show of force? Will this cause the Libyans to be more circumspect in terms of whatever terrorism they may or may not be contemplating? Will it create a situation where the peace process in the Middle East may be able to move a little bit more relative to Israel and Syria, perhaps some of the other, and Jordan in that case too? These are the questions which now have to come out of it, and it's very unclear, I think, at this point, as to what the result of it would be. So,
should we concern ourselves in a case like this that such an attack might provoke more terrorism?
Sure, I think we should. The question has to come here as to whether or not the United States can allow a Libyan kind of random terror to simply occur almost in different parts of the world where our citizens' lives may be at stake, and that sort of thing, and we have no real way of responding to it. And the old phrase of preemption here perhaps is somewhat useful to look at it here. That the Reagan administration, the United States Naval Force, is making a statement saying Gaddafi, in a sense, beware and be on guard. Now, in dealing with an individual of this type, it's a calculated risk as to whether or not that sort of behavior is going to work the way that you want, and that's, I think, what we're investigating in the future. It's not a Grenada type of situation. There's a couple of foreign policy analysts have looked at this and said the Grenada situation was a situation where we essentially intervened, accomplished what we were trying to do, that is, protect these lives, got out of the situation. This in the in the Gulf of Sidra is not like that. It doesn't have an ending. All it has is this is the end of a chapter, or this is the end of an instance, and the next chapter has yet to be played out.
If you're watching this program or listening to it, you may think that we're waffling around on this issue, and let me try to make some statements and see if my colleagues agree or disagree. First of all, if we are waffling on this issue, one thing we can look at and say is that few serious conflicts have neat conclusions. And I think what I've heard from Bruce in the last several minutes is this very fact that this is a very serious conflict that involves not only the Libyans, but it also involves others in Western Europe and also the Middle East, and we don't have any neat conclusions for you today. I think also in terms of looking what Bruce and Dwight have said so far is that what we have here is measured activism versus the post-Vietnam aversion to using military power in support of foreign policy. And as you look at this Reagan doctrine, as we look at Nicaragua and also the Middle East, it seems that in terms of the public opinion polls, that most Americans do not want their country pushed around, kind of in quotes, but at the same time, they are unwilling to suffer the agonies of the television by watching sacrifice unless we have been invaded. So Americans feel unless they are invaded, they don't want to lose American lives in places like the Gulf, etc. I mean, how does that fit?
Let me react to that. I think that the question we should ask is, what have we gained from this military action? Because military action isn't designed just for action. It is designed in part for domestic consumption. But what political goals have we gained? We haven't, I think, hurt Gaddafi any. The Arab world has rallied around him. He himself says that he drove off the forces of the United States. We haven't ended terrorism. If we were to look in the realm of international affairs, what have we accomplished? We haven't accomplished anything with Gaddafi. Our allies have reacted differently depending on how close they are to Gaddafi. The ones on the Mediterranean basin have not reacted in the same way we would react. They have tended to be somewhat put off by this, whereas the allies further away, I think, have tended to be more supportive. So what actually have we gained? We blew out a transmitter for the SA-5s. We sank a couple of ships, but that isn't connected directly with the terrorists. So my question would be, we've used military means, but what have we accomplished politically? And I don't see that we've accomplished much politically except for domestic consumption.
Dwight, is this kind of illustration similar to the Israelis as they use this sophisticated technology and then they attack the Palestinian camps, and it seems that they don't gain very much? You have technology versus the unsophistication of terrorists.
Sure. I mean, there's no point at which Gaddafi could match us technologically. I mean, he would be the first to admit that. And this was done surgically. We apparently didn't lose any of our equipment or our men, so it came off pretty cheaply. But in the end, it didn't have anything to do with the terrorist camps. The only thing you've got to change in order to change that is Gaddafi. From all appearances, it has had no particular impact upon him. So it seems to me it's a kind of measure that doesn't accomplish very much internationally. It doesn't accomplish very much with Gaddafi. It confirms him in his belief that we're out to get him. And at least judging from his past record, which is rather long, that he hasn't scared very easily.
Is there a point in this whole situation where you think moderate Arab countries, let's use the example of Egypt, both the Mubarak regime and previous regime under Anwar Sadat were very much concerned about a possible military action by Gaddafi against them, or Gaddafi's other military actions in Chad and other places in the Middle East and in Africa. Is it possible that some of these Arab states, while not saying anything publicly, may privately applaud the U.S. action here?
Well, as you know, the Egyptians have come out lately and said that we have asked them several times to help overthrow Gaddafi. Now, this may impact on Gaddafi. He may think, well, if I get too involved in Egypt, the U.S. will come in. But it may have a destabilizing effect on Egypt. It may very well be that if they are tied too closely to the United States, Egypt is not particularly stable. It might precipitate a problem for Mubarak. His condition is not too steady.
If there's nothing to accomplish in Libya from what we did, is there anything to accomplish in Nicaragua with, say, $100 million in aid?
I think that's a little different matter. I think, as John pointed out, that becomes ideologically involved. Yeah. It becomes involved with the Monroe Doctrine. And there's a lot of American principles, it seems to me, that are involved here. So you can make a stronger case, I think, than you can with the Gulf of Sidra.
We move into the Senate. The House rejected the aid. The Senate turned around, supported it back in the House. Are we likely to see President Reagan get what he wants? John?
I think so. As a couple of weeks ago on this program, I think I said the die is already cast. The conflict has been going on for some time there in Central America. Looking at the vote, it was a vote of 53 to 47. Ironically, there were 11 Democrats supporting this vote, 42 members of the Republican Party in the Senate. So the figure is some $100 million going to Nicaragua. The rebels there, I should emphasize that, of course. It seems to be a personal kind of thing that the president has. He has a personal kind of, I'm thinking vendetta. I don't know that I want to, that's the real way of putting it, but to bring down the regimes, the totalitarian regimes in Libya and Nicaragua. And he also has a purpose for attempting to try to demonstrate that terrorism has a price. So the problem comes, as I've implied, I think, is how do you implement this kind of policy?
I can't really understand Reagan on this because he overemphasizes things and he makes statements that are not true. He comes out and says the Nicaraguans are engaged in the drug trade, and then the people who are connected with that say, no, they aren't connected with it. And he said there are guerrillas in Brazil, and the Brazilians say, no, there are no guerrillas here. So almost every statement he makes seems to be contrary to the fact, and yet he keeps persisting that Nicaragua is a big problem. And I'm not quite sure what the problem is for Reagan. Why is it that he is so upset with the Nicaraguans? What is it that causes him this particular problem?
I think he seems to bounce back between ideology and pragmatism. And he tends to talk ideology, but he tends to implement pragmatism. I think the other thing we could look at is that the Reagan White House is very different in the last couple of years, the last year or so, since Donald Reagan has been chief of staff. And the focus is to let Reagan be Reagan. And if Reagan is going to be Reagan, perhaps a more ideological bent is to come forth. Whereas previously, in the first 4 years, the pragmatism of James Baker as chief of staff of the White House seemed to come about.
Let me try to respond to Dwight's question, too. And, you know, please feel free to respond to this observation, too. It seems to me that what the thrust of the Reagan administration's opposition to what's going on in Nicaragua has been not only that, indeed, Daniel Ortega is a communist, or is about to become a communist, or he's somewhere in there, you know, and that constitutes some degree of unacceptability for Reagan, but also the possibility of additional Russian bases in this hemisphere, Nicaragua as well as Cuba and so forth. John was saying earlier in the program, you know, our viewers may think that this seems to be somewhat of a wishy-washy kind of observation because we can't seem to tie anything down in specific terms. And the Nicaraguan situation just seems to be such a classic example of that right now. In 1983, we saw a situation where the House of Representatives was willing to stand up to Reagan on the question of aid to the Contras. They did. And what does Ortega do? But he goes to Moscow, and the whole situation unravels itself a little bit. The House of Representatives has stood up again. And what does apparently what had happened was some sort of a minor skirmish of some sort between the Nicaraguans and the Hondurans. Now, that perhaps may not have been a factor in the House vote because Reagan, or in the Senate vote, because Reagan is much stronger in the Senate than he is in the House. In fact, Republicans control the Senate. But in the next vote, which will come up in the House on aid to the Contras, which will come up in about 2 weeks, this is bound to become a factor. Whatever happened in terms of this renewed Nicaraguan presence in Central America. And it just makes you wonder, to a certain extent, Edward Luttwak at the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies has made the statement recently that things are not the way they seem in international affairs. And it just seems to be that this particular observation has a certain amount of currency right now, because the administration is pursuing one track. The Nicaraguans are saying, on the one hand, I don't know why the United States should have any reason to be afraid of us. We're a small country. We only have, you know, X number of million people, and so what if we have an army of 60,000? It doesn't compare in any degree to what the United States has militarily. And then here comes some sort of a military action, and it doesn't really add up in that sense. But in the political sense, it does strengthen the Reagan administration's case, because they can say, at least that in this respect, that what we've been arguing about the dangers of Nicaragua have proved to be the case.
It's interesting. One would think, if one didn't know better, that Ortega and Reagan were in cahoots, because Ortega seems to make the moves that would be calculated to have the worst possible result. course, part of what happened is that they're publicly directed at the Honduran incursion, and evidently this has been going on for some time, and these raids have not been called to our attention. I think it's a condition similar to the problem in Cambodia and Vietnam, where we were occasionally making incursions into Cambodia to prevent the Vietnamese from coming down from the north. And I think it was, again, the kind of operation pretty much kept secret. And it may very well have been that the Reagan administration brings it to the fore right at this particular time. Unfortunately, for Reagan, it should probably have occurred before the House vote. It came a little bit late for that particular vote.
I think another issue that is fascinating to me is the use of technology. For example, the HARM missile was used. That's an abbreviation. And what it does, it's only about 150 inches long. It flies very low over the ocean. And then it hones for the electronic emissions of radar transmitters. And so the Soviets, with all their paranoia, just because you're not paranoid does not mean that somebody's not after you after all. So with their paranoia, either perceived or not perceived, they must think this American technology is really something. And I think technology is a very important issue here, but the other issue is how does technology meet the problems of terrorism?
Well, I mean, isn't that part of it that we wanted to let the Soviets know that their apprehensions, their paranoia was justified?
Yeah.
Is that in fact it was a show of force for the Soviets as well as the Libyans, who just happened to be the bully on the block that was easy to pick on because nobody liked them anyway.
Well, of course, before we went into the Gulf of Sidra, we had some ships doing signals collection next to the Russians, moved into the Black Sea, and in a sense aroused the Russians a little bit. So I think, again, the point of the Sixth Fleet is to show the flag wherever it wants to show the flag.
And it's one thing to have a military force, as the Shah of Iran had an outstanding military force. The issue is how do you use it? And I think the one thing we've said before in this program is that military force has to be used in exquisite, effective means. Otherwise, it's not very valuable. But getting to another issue, this obviously is an Indiana program, and we've been talking about a national, even international issues. How does these issues of Nicaragua affect us here in Indiana in terms of a particular impact, other than the fact that Senator Lugar is the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, and he has a lot of influence there, and Lee Hamilton is also important in that area in the House, too. Do these issues have a particular impact upon Indiana?
John, let's take a couple points. Number one, the Reagan administration has been trying for some time now to have restorations made in its level of defense spending and to try to garner public support for keeping the defense budget at a certain level. Whether or not these sorts of things are related to that whole issue, I couldn't say. But certainly, if you're trying to convince the American population, including voters and taxpayers in Indiana, that the world is a dangerous place, and we need to prepare ourselves for that, the events of the last few weeks would certainly bear out the need for a strong defense and for not making sizable cuts in the Pentagon budget. If you're thinking in terms of the stability of the American economy, and we're also noticing right now a severe drop in oil prices, and the value of that, is noticeable for everybody. Our gas costs less. Our dollar buys more gas. We can drive farther, and so on and so on. And the cost of doing business go down as a result. We also see at the same time that the Reagan administration is dispatching the vice president to go to Saudi Arabia to try to bring some stability in the price of oil, so that we don't have an unstable, almost panic situation relative to American banks and American oil companies that are heavily stretched on the oil issue. So those two things are directly related to, I think, what's going on internationally.
Yeah, I think Reagan is trying to bolster his standing. He has not had a very good record lately with the Congress, particularly with the House. I think the Gulf of Sidra case could very well bring up questions of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And indeed, some real questions could be asked whether or not he could justify this particular position. And I think that in general, the incursion into the Gulf of Cedar has been very popular and has bolstered Reagan's ratings. So in a way, he may be going to Indiana and to other states to say, okay, look, I'm leading you, I'm taking a strong position, and the people in Congress are the ones who are frustrating some of these things. I think this action probably effectively blocks the Congress from considering whether or not Reagan should bring the matter of the attack on the American ships to the Congress.
Are we seeing a different Ronald Reagan here from what we might have seen 4 years ago, a man who might be facing re-election 4 years ago, who cannot run now? Is he able to talk a little tougher, be a little bit more aggressive?
Yes, and I think historically presidents in their second terms are much more assertive in terms of foreign policy. You can always find exceptions to that, but the fact that executive powers are much stronger in the foreign policy realm than they are in domestic policy, I think plays into a president's hand. And if a president doesn't have to run for re-election, I think he does have a degree of latitude that he didn't have prior to that.
Certainly he's much more hawkish than Lugar, and a lot more hawkish than Hamilton. These people have been much more moderate on both occasions.
Well, I'm not sure what it means to be hawkish or not to be hawkish in this context. As you say, Dwight, what other option does he have in terms of the military option? I mean, the military option, the Gulf of Sidra situation is something that's not new. I mean, Libya had been claiming this territory for some time, so it was a 13-year problem.
So that's a rhetorical question. We won't answer that. We're out of time. Thanks to our panelists, Dwight Hoover, Bruce Gale Hood, and John Rouse for the commentary. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.